Okay, folks, this is number 41 of Going South. I'm excited today to reconnect with someone that I've learned a whole lot from, both literally and as a role model. I got to get to know her a little bit better back probably in 2002, actually 2002, 2003, when she was kind enough to let me stay at her and David Billings' house, her partner, when I was doing research on white anti-racist, and that research took me to New Orleans. So I'm talking today with Marjorie Freeman. She's a longtime kind of social justice advocate. She originated from California, but moved to Houston in 1966. There she was engaged in kind of anti-war work as well as civil rights work. In 1966, Houston was a pretty volatile place, a lot of Klan activity. She later moved to New Orleans. Throughout this time too, she's been a long time educator in kind of the public sector as well as kind of the nonprofit world, also doing work around adult literacy. For a while, she worked with the National Council of Churches around child advocacy. And at some point in all that, and we'll talk about this, she bumped into the People's Institute for Survival when she went to New Orleans. But what's clear in Marjorie's biography is this lifelong commitment to justice and kind of making the world a more peaceful and fair place. So Marjorie, thank you so much for making time today. It's good to see your face. It's been, I don't know how many years, but it's good to see you again. So did I miss anything in there that I should
No, that's
highlight?
good. That's helpful. Thank you, Mark. I
Yeah.
was so pleased to be able to be with you. When David was on your show a couple of weeks ago, I said, "Oh, I'd love to do that," and then you read my mind. So I'm
Yeah,
just
yeah,
thrilled.
and I intended to ask him when I was talking to him to say, hey, please, because I don't think any contact stuff for you. So thank you for that. And as well, I said something to him last week. Y'all were some of the first white people I ever saw talk publicly about racism and what it meant to challenge racism and what it meant to be anti-racist. So you're etched in my memory, and I appreciate what I've learned from you, both in terms of what you've said and what you've lived. So I'm just giddy to talk to folks that have made a really positive impact on my life. But I guess we can just start off like we were talking before we pushed record. Was it sounded like your folks are enjoying the kind of post World War II boom. They moved from the East Coast to California. Were they kind of classic liberals? Um,
Um, well, that's part of my story. Maybe I could just tell a little bit more about that if you
yeah,
want me to, Mark,
yeah,
because my parents and my family is what I've affectionately come to know as the knowing class.
uh,
We were highly educated people from the Northeast, generations, literally generations of college graduates and professionals. And my family had been in the ministry and in medicine. Really, those were the two professions that my families, both my mother's and my father's families, came out of. Um, and when we got to California, it was a very new place, as you can imagine. In the mid 1940s, it was a time of great sort of tumult. There was so much activity going on, and so finding a place in a suburb of San Francisco, beautiful, beautiful place. And I didn't realize until I was older. Well, no, I guess I was about 12 when I realized it had a covenant that said no people of color will live here. And the way I found that out was that we had a maid working with us, and she and her husband had wanted to build a house in the town where we lived. And she was forbidden from doing that. And my mother, to her credit, went to bat for her and said, "This is not appropriate. This is impossible. This is wrong." But the rules held. The rules held for numbers of more years. And so Sadie and Roscoe McIntosh built it outside of the city limits. They built
yeah,
their home. And it was my awakening to this notion. I didn't really think about it. We did not talk about race. We
yeah,
just didn't talk about it.
yeah,
But it was very, as you said, Mark, it was like I lived in a liberal family. We never used negative words about people of color. We never talked about them, period. It just wasn't around. We lived with the reality that Black and brown people were going to be our servants. That's what my reality was. And it took me years to be able to say that publicly. Because I used to say, as a progressive white adult, I thought to myself, oh, that's terrible, I shouldn't say that. But what's important is that we do need to know where we came from. We need to know our history.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I grew up. And then just to add another chapter, if you want me to, when I started to get ready to go to college, it was in 1958. And the ferment of the civil rights movement in the South was just bubbling. There had been the Montgomery bus boycott. There had been a number of things. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was emerging as a nationally known leader. And I wanted to be there. I wanted to be part of that. I could see it. So I applied to a college in California that had just begun an exchange program with Fisk University, which, as you know, is an historically Black college in Nashville,
right?
Tennessee.
Yeah.
And so I said to myself, oh, this is going to be wonderful. I get to go on this exchange program. Won't it be great? So I brought the application home to my parents that Christmas. And as you can imagine, maybe you can't, but what, of course, my parents said was no.
They probably said,
they were not
did they say hell no?
They said, well, they said absolutely not. And I pushed 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 because I had thought, oh, this is a nice liberal family. Right. But what I realized and what my mother finally said, and she said it out loud to me, and I'll never forget it. She said, I don't want you dating Negro boys. So it
wasn't a physical safety concern though, huh?
No, it had everything to do with socializing with, quote, Negroes. That's what our term was at the time.
Yeah.
And I got furious. I got so angry because I had been betrayed. I thought that their values were different than what they were. So I got mad. And what a lot of young white people did when they got mad with their families is they left because we could, because we had the wherewithal to be able to leave. And so years went by, college finished and all of that. And I ended up finally in New Orleans. And in New Orleans, I ended up teaching. And I was teaching in a school in the Treme community of New Orleans, which, is some of your listeners might know, is the oldest Black community in the South. And it was the one where really the birthplace of jazz, very, very significant community.
Is Louis Armstrong from there?
Louis Armstrong. In fact, the park right in the center of Treme is named for him. You're absolutely right. And some of your listeners might have remembered the HBO series that was done a few years ago called Treme, and it was about that community. But the point I'm making is that when I got there as a teacher, I knew nothing about the community. I knew nothing about the history. I knew nothing about the families that I was working with. I knew nothing about the children. I just was a good, well-intentioned young white woman wanting to do good. My family had done that for generations. We wanted to do good. And then I went to this workshop that was called Undoing Racism.
What year are we talking, Marjorie?
We're talking, I had been teaching for about 10 years, and so it was about 1983.
Okay.
And I went to this workshop. And what happened is that I was given some history that I didn't know. And I said to you at the beginning, I said, I came from people who thought we were thought we were supposed to know everything.
Yeah.
That's what we thought about ourselves. We really did. We set the rules and regulations for everybody else, this sort of white Protestant, upper class, highly educated professional class. And when I got to this workshop, I realized I didn't know anything. And it was infuriating. It was humiliating. It was really sort of scary. I thought to myself, whoa, this is amazing how much we don't know.
I had an existential crisis.
It was an existential crisis. And the great good fortune for me at the time is that I had people with me and around me, family and friends, both David, my husband, and other people like Ron Chisholm, who was the founder of the People's Institute, Barbara Major, and others who are going to come on this show, I think.
Yeah,
And
hopefully.
they were the people who helped me maneuver into this new way of thinking about things. Not to say I was a bad person, not to say I
Yeah,
was
yeah,
terrible,
yeah,
but to recognize that I indeed I had been misled.
yeah.
I had been misinformed, like so many of us in this country. So that started me on my journey toward becoming an anti-racist educator.
Yeah. Can we go back to the Bay Area for just a second? Because one of the things I was wondering, was your dad a vet? Was I
He
mean,
was a, yes,
did he?
he had mustered out of the, he was a surgeon, and he had gone overseas in a MASH unit over to Burma and worked overseas in the MASH unit, had come back to California, mustered out in California in a little small town up in the mountains. And that was when he discovered California, like millions of others, and realized that he would like to stay there. And so he moved the whole family. There were 4 of us children. He moved all of us out to California.
In terms of that, because one of the things and I'm talking to a lot of working class people here, right? And they just don't see racism as something that's gone away. But did he take advantage of the GI Bill or anything like that? Or
You
did
know,
he
I
have
don't,
did he already have the
it's,
money to do
the
it?
GI Bill he used was for buying a house.
Yeah, right. So
That was
I
what
just
he was
don't,
able to do.
yeah, I just don't want us to miss this point, because I think we have an opportunity to tie the past and present, right? So you just told that story, and I know you know this, so I don't mean to be
No, right.
paternalistic or anything, but that maid that couldn't get that house in the Bay Area, how that wealth today, if that house would have stayed in that family, right?
You got it. You
Right.
got it.
That's deep, you know. And so when we talk about systematic historical racism, right, and how it lives in the present structurally,
That's right.
nobody can, you know, it's an elite group that has can stay in that and live in the Bay Area, right? And one of the things we know is that home ownership was pretty new right after the Second World War, largely because, and that's how families passed down wealth. Right.
You're
So
absolutely right.
that story is a huge one in terms of understanding, right?
And one of the things about that is that my family had been, even though they came from wealth, they had been renters as a young couple with a new family. They had rented houses in the East where they were living before. They rented the first house in California, and then the GI Bill enabled them to buy this house in the Bay Area, as you said. And one of the things that I can remember to this day is that it wasn't but about maybe 10 years, I'm not sure about exactly what, but almost not much more than 10 years, that I remember my parents burning the mortgage papers because they had paid off their mortgage. And that was such an enormous thing to, as you say, they no longer were indebted. They could just continue to pay forward, so that when we grew up as children, we were able to go to school without going to borrow a whole lot of money.
Right.
We were able to go and travel. We were able to do all kinds of things because they were not burdened with that debt once we became college-aged children.
Do you, this is kind of $1 million question I get asked all the time. It's one I researched when I was doing my graduate work, but I mean, why, you know, a lot of us just become our parents, right? I mean, that's how socialization works. That's how tradition and authority works, right? Do you have any theories about why you, and it might have just been the times, right? It could have been peers, it could have been the consciousness of the time, but you could have just been another good white liberal that didn't openly discriminate or call people names, right? Why do you think you as an individual didn't replicate the patterns that your parents did as liberals?
That's a wonderful question. It really is, Mark. And I've thought a lot about it because I spent probably, the first 20 years of my young adult life being mad at my parents for not doing the right thing and rebelling against them. And really what happened after that is that
were you woke? Were you woke? You know what I mean? That word that we use today, you know what I mean?
I was definitely not woke. I was simply a rebel. Yeah. I was going to be radical. I didn't know what it meant. I didn't have a clue what that meant, but I was just going to be radical. because my parents had disappointed me by showing me the limits of their liberalism. But the truth of the matter is that what happened as I became a parent myself is I started to really reflect about my parents and thinking about who they were and whose they were and how they had grown up and the values they imparted to me, despite their racism, what I later called racism, despite whatever their limitations were. What I recognized is they had taught me this notion of being a civic participant, of being somebody who would take responsibility for my role as a citizen in this country and for being active in this world. And I think that my mother in particular had this very strong civic mindedness, and she was very participatory in all the kinds of civic groups in that small town where we lived. My father was more classic, working, going to work, coming home, that kind of thing. But on the other hand, I realized that those values, and I often liken them to an onion, where you have to peel away some of the things that maybe make you off put by them. And you have to really recognize every single person's humanity. And that's where I finally have come to in my journey. And the journey is ongoing. I'm still a learner because the journey is ongoing. And I think that is really probably what they taught me the most. And then I would say, in addition to their values of humanity and civic mindedness and faith, we were raised in a Christian tradition. We were very strongly Christian in the church and this community where I grew up. And what I recognized about that is that those values persist, and they're in all of us. And what we have to find is a way of recognizing that some of the overlay of the dominant culture, if you will, of the culture that says whiteness is what matters most. If we could get through that, if we can understand where that came from and push through that, not to discard it at all. I mean, I'm not going to not be white, but what I do understand is that my whiteness isn't who I am. It's what I've been told I am in this society and have been given authority and power and status as a result of it. I didn't ask for it. I don't particularly like it, but it's what I have.
Can we hang with your mom for just a second? Because at the same time, I was talking to somebody, I reviewed a book for someone who grew up in the 50s, and his father had a business in a small community in Mississippi, and his father racially wanted to, do the right thing. He wasn't openly racist, but he also knew that if he stood up to the Klan, and this guy didn't recognize this guy was mad at his dad for not fighting the Klan. But I think it's a little more complicated than that in some ways, right? If he was economically dependent on the white community to feed his family. I'm not justifying white complicity or silence, you know what I mean? So I think in many of those contexts, and I think, having done a lot of lynching research in the Deep South, it's pretty clear to me that white folks would have been lynched aside folks of color. Not to justify what the brutality and macabre nature of what's happened here, right? But when you were talking about your mom, though, she advocated for equal housing in some ways, right? Did she see?
Right.
Did they see themselves as racist, do you think, or did they see themselves as liberals?
No, they did not. They did not. They understood the time of the times they were living. And they recognized, they would have, if you had said, in fact, when I said to my mother, "You're prejudiced," she was really shocked. But she said, in fact, she said yes, So and what she was recognizing maybe for the first time is that these ideas, these feelings of being better than had been inculcated inside of her without her even realizing. Like, her father was also a doctor. He was also a person who had spent a great deal of time in China. And he had great respect and regard for the Chinese people, for the Chinese culture, for the Chinese way of medicine. And he was sort of sidelined in this country When he came back from China, where he was a missionary, a medical missionary, he was supposed to be bringing American ways to the Chinese. And he came back and he said, wait a minute, the Chinese have a huge amount to teach us.
Yeah.
And that was not going over very well. And so these ideas of mutuality, of learning from one another, was really crucial in our family.
Yeah. Well, can we go back to the People's Institute experience? Because folks who don't know what that is, and it almost sounds cultish when we talk about it outside of a context, right? Like these folks went somewhere and drank the Kool-Aid and they hate themselves now and they're guilty white people, you know, the whole story. But and I'm grappling with this locally now, right? Because it's interesting how white supremacy manifests itself with some folks I'm reaching out to who, you know, want to, well, for example, you know what's happening with the whole CRT struggle, right? Basically CRT is really any history that makes white people uncomfortable, is what I would argue, right? And that's not what CRT is. I've taught CRT, and you get CRT if you go to graduate school, kind of thing. It's not in public school. And in fact, that's the whole problem in many ways, that we don't teach an accurate history. But back to the Institute for just a second, and I think you said this, what I'm seeing here is folks saying, get over history. And then I'll ask them, well, tell me what you know about our history. Tell me what you know about our local history, how this community was set up. And I don't certainly know it all, right? But the power in saying, get over something, and if you don't, you're a racist, right? Even though I don't know what I'm talking about, and telling you to get over, you know what I mean? That's some real power. But what it sounded like when you, well, I guess first, how did you get quote unquote recruited to go to the workshop? Was it part of the job you had, or how did that play out?
Not at all. No, actually, I was, because I was teaching in the Treme community, I was teaching and getting to know Ron Chisholm, who was one of the founders of the organization that teaches that course in Undoing Racism. And then my husband, David, had already been involved with them for a number of years. And so it was a very natural, organic way. It wasn't a recruiting at all. It was sort of like, gee, this looks interesting. I think I'll do this. Not realizing how much I would learn, because as I said, I came into this with a real arrogance. Don't teach me anything. I already know everything.
Well, that's the thing. Did you know what you were getting into? Because you know what I'm saying? Like when I went to it, I thought, well, sure, I'll go to that thing.
That's right. That's how I was.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things about, you know, as your point is so important, Mark, because that whole idea of let's just get over it is really dominating our society these days, isn't it? And it goes back to, if you think about where it started, it really started with the civil rights movement in the 1960s. Because what we did in the 1960s, if you'll recall, is we passed laws after years and years and decades of struggle to create sort of a more equitable society that lives up to our wonderful notions of what we should be as a nation. We passed laws that said you may not discriminate on the basis of race. And so what we did in this society, and this is the part that I think affects so many of us, most of us, maybe all of us, is that we created this kind of colorblind ideology. We said, oh, okay, well, if racism isn't legal anymore, then it doesn't exist anymore.
Right.
We have an even playing field. Everybody has equal opportunity. And what we teach in the People's Institute, and what I finally learned, is that it isn't about how I feel about somebody or how they feel about me. We set these systems in place in this country that were benefiting me, whether I knew it or not. Didn't even matter whether I knew it or not. And so when the laws were passed saying that it was no longer legal to discriminate, the systems and institutions didn't get the message. They didn't get the email. They continued to do what they do.
Yeah.
And what it did to us, what that colorblind ideology, as I call it, did for us, is it made it impossible for us to talk about racism. Because to talk about racism was to be racist. to talk about racism among those of us who are white was to be divisive. You know, that's those people over there, those terrible, terrible people over there. Those are the people who are racist. And we weren't able to talk about it. So really, for the last 70 years, we have been in the sense of denial of saying, no, we don't need to talk about racism. And the systems and institutions, as I said, they didn't get that. And so what we have today, despite the laws, what we have today is all the systems and institutions with the same results as they've always had. White people are by and large doing better. This is not every individual by any means, but Black people are always at the bottom because that's kind of what the institutions were set up to do.
Right.
And we don't know that. We think that everything is equal. And so
Well,
we get very angry
yeah,
when we're told, no, 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 there's racism in this country. No, no, no. People just have to work harder.
yeah,
They have to try harder. You know?
yeah. Well, I
It's a
think
very complicated time.
well, there's that, and a couple of things in there that come to mind is the systems, you know, Brown's in 54, we don't desegregate. Our school system, Marjorie, finally got out from a desegregation consent order from the Department of Justice in Lowndes County in 2012. And it's because we had to file another civil rights complaint against that school system, right? So I think there's this other twist that I see white folks doing. Not only do we not know the history, right, but we also act as if we gave this already. We already resolved it. And again, speaking of a history we really don't understand, right, which again, I think is just us knowing it all, like you were talking about earlier, right? And so, but and help me if you would agree with this, but I want to go back to the more personal stuff in a second if we can. It seems to me when folks of color make some progress in terms of getting in institutions, having institutional power, like during Reconstruction, those of us who are white freak out and go, something must be wrong, right? Oh my, there's voter fraud, there's, right? And that seems to be, to me, we're kind of in what Reverend Barber's calling a second Reconstruction, right? Anytime we make some kind of racial progress, you know, and not just around race, but around gay rights, around women's rights and equity and sexism, right? And I say this because my liberal friends, I really struggle with them because they keep talking about the system as being broken, right? And so are the conservative friends of mine. The system's broken, and I keep saying, no, it's working perfectly. You know, that's a whole lot, but does that make sense?
No, you're saying something that's really, really important, I think, Mark. And one of the ways that I've often looked at it, in fact, recently was very influenced by a book by Heather McGhee called The Sum of Us, where she describes how the systems of segregation, the systems of racism have impacted all of us. And what we don't realize, those of us who are white, because we don't know our history, we think that this whole idea of affirmative action, for example, is something that's giving to other people what is taking away from me. And it's not taking away from me. What's taking away from me are the policies and the programs and the cultural ways that have denied us all this full life to live together. For example, she uses a wonderful example in my book, because we were living in Mississippi for a number of years where there was no public swimming pool whatsoever. Because in the 1950s, all the public swimming pools, most of them across the whole country, not just in the South, but across the country, they were all closed. They were all filled in. They were all bulldozed. They're all gone. So suddenly, not only do Black kids have no place to go to swim, white kids have no place to go to swim. I mean, it's just amazing. And what she's trying to say is that we have been caught up in this idea, the zero sum, as it's sometimes called. If you get something, it's from me. It's taking away from me. And that whole idea of scarcity is really dominating our thinking these days, isn't it? Well, and I think that's where I think we have to really focus our attention is, how do we get past that?
Yeah. Well, even when we talk about privilege, I've always said there's nothing wrong with privilege. The problem is everybody doesn't enjoy those same privileges, right? You know,
Yeah.
that's what the struggle is about. It's not about being a guilty white privileged person. It's about how do we make sure everybody enjoys all the status and privileges that I do as a white man, you know?
Yeah.
But can we go back to your, like, that moment, because you said this a little bit earlier, and this goes back to history, right? I had been working in the housing projects here with a nonprofit, right? And so I went to one of the workshops, and it was Ron Chisholm. I'll never forget it. And I'd also organized against the Klan, because the Klan was still organizing here, and you know, Ron, you know, so I'd done all this stuff. I challenged my family. I'd been disowned multiple times, you know, and they always re-owned me. And I thought that ownership language was always interesting, and wondered where that came from. Like, I didn't know you guys owned me to disown me, but that's a whole nother conversation, right? But here I am, the good white liberal in the deep South, getting my butt kicked on a regular basis. And Ron Chisholm, you know, I'm in this workshop with him, and I'm working in the Black community. I'm working in public housing, providing services through the agency that employed me. He goes, well, you know, in a nutshell, he basically said, "What are you doing there? You know, and you're racist for being there." And I was just like, who in the hell is this guy? He don't know me. You know, he doesn't know what I've done. Right. Then he went on to say, well, what do you know about this community? Who invited you into this community? Why do you think you know what this community needs? Especially if you don't even know the history of this community, you don't know how it got that way. Right. So, and I just said, like, he was right. Like, and not only that, why did I have all those assumptions, right? And for me, as a good white liberal, racial justice meant fighting so those folks could be like me. It wasn't that I should ever change, that my life and my outlook would be fundamentally altered, right? So to go back to it, like, and then that's not even getting into the question of white identity. We've got some pretty hardcore semi-alt-right folks, conservative folks here, and I keep getting asked by them, what is it you want? You know, what is your mission? What is it? And they're very constitutionally oriented people. Like, what is it you're going to change in the Constitution? And I keep saying to them, nobody wants to change anything, just want the place to live up to what it says, right? So, but back to that kind of angst, you know, did you have to go through I think first the reality that you are racialized as white, and you could play the gender card, right? You could have said, well, I'm also oppressed, right? Which is true, you know, or at least in a hierarchy, right? And it seems to me that one of the ways whiteness works is we don't want to have a race. We want to be individuals, right? So there's that piece. Was that hard? And then you alluded to a minute ago, like, I had to reevaluate everything I thought I had, quote unquote, accomplished, you know, if the system's built for me. And that's an ongoing process. So what was that like to hear, to realize, you know what, I'm part of the largest racial group in this country. I am, whether I want to be or not, I am. And then even as a woman that's catching hell because of patriarchy and misogyny and all these other things. And not only that, why don't you think you locked down on that one? Because I'm sure you've seen plenty of white women, you know, get paralyzed. There's a book, White Fragility, right? We should write the book White Paralysis or White Numbness, right? But that's a whole lot. So yeah, if you could speak to any of it.
It's a wonderful, you're making my mind swirl with memories and with thoughts and feelings, really, because I think one of the things that I found myself having to do was to really just look at my community, look at my family, look at the people I came from in a different light. And the light wasn't so much of pointing a finger at them and saying how terrible they were. That is not useful. I mean, you know that. It is not useful. What I found myself having to do is to go to my family and be there with them and talk with them as human beings, and find our common interests, find the things that we love to do together, find the values that we share, and be able to have these conversations and be able to talk with them in such a way that the conversation about race doesn't become contentious on the front end, but it becomes something that's one of curiosity. well, tell me more. Why is this? And I'll tell you, one of the ways I found myself doing this was really quite recently. When David and I moved to a little small town in Mississippi a few years ago, we lived there for about 9 years, Macomb, Mississippi. And Macomb is only at 12,000 people. It's a very small town. And we were coming in. I have to laugh now because we looked at each other as we were moving back and we said, give us a year. We're good. We're organizers. We'll begin this
Transform this
conversation.
town.
It'll be easy to have these conversations. Well, of course it is not.
Yeah.
And you know that better than most. But what I did find is that when I would go into a group of white people, I've joined for example, the Master Gardeners program as a way of kind of getting to know some of the white people in the community, because it was a mostly white, mostly middle-aged white women who were part of that. It wasn't just that, but it was largely that. And I thought, well, this is a good way of getting to know folks. And it was. But what happened would be, I would still be traveling to go to do workshops around the country. And, most of the people who live in small towns don't go traveling to New York or Seattle just every day. Right. So I would come back from a meeting or a conference or whatever I was doing, and I would be sitting with these folks and visiting with them, and they would say, how was your trip to New York? And I said, oh, I had a good time. And somebody who didn't know me would lean in and say, New York? What were you doing in New York? And I said, well, I do these workshops around race and racism. And I say that in a completely normal, just like I was talking about going to Saks Fifth Avenue to buy a dress or going to see something at a museum. I do these workshops around race and racism. And what I found happened is that some of the people who were in that setting, for example, they would immediately find something really, really important to do in the next room. That's fine. Yeah. That's what happens. Yeah. But there might be others, and there were others who would lean into the conversation and say, really, race and racism? Tell me more. And that would be sort of the place we could start. It wasn't because we knew each other so well or trusted each other so well. It's because we love flowers and we love plants. And they were curious about why I was doing this. And so I would just talk in a sort of normal way. I would say, well, what we do is we have these workshops where we talk about how racism got started and why it got started in this country and why does it persist. It's not about blame. It's about our understanding of things. Yeah. And what I have found, and I would say this, and I think I say this pretty regularly, is that I have found that this work of being what I now call myself an anti-racist, I find this the most human, it's the most liberating way of being that I can imagine. It gives me this opportunity to be in conversations with all kinds of people. And that really is, to me, the most great benefit for it. And just to add to that, both David and I committed to this work, raised our children in a household where racism was a normal part of the conversation. We talked about it all the time. So our 3 white kids, they all grew up kind of knowing who they were. Oh, that's not abnormal. That's just how things are. That's how we are. And so they knew who they were. And that gave them a rootedness that really has held to this day with their own children. Now we have 8 grandchildren, and we want this to continue to them. So that whole way of normalizing this conversation so that it's not an attack, or it's not a putting things in quotation marks or dipping your voice down when you say the word black because you don't think you know what to say. I mean, we're really babies at having these conversations, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I think it just, like all things that are new, it just takes time to get comfortable having the conversations. But why did y'all think y'all would go into Mississippi and transform that community is what I want to hear. What was that about, Marjorie?
Arrogance. Yeah. Simple as that. Just plain old arrogance.
I think that might be kind of, is that white supremacy again? Is that all knowing again? Is that thing,
Well, David's a Mississippian.
Yeah.
And what we found when we moved to that community is that we found ourselves in very close and important relationships with our neighbors, all of whom were working class, white, very, very conservative people. And we loved them, and they loved us. And when we put our Obama signs on the lawn in front of our house, They would shoot at them with their guns and take them down and do all these things. And we were still in good and right relationship with them. And that was the lesson for us. We weren't going to change people's minds, but we were modeling something that was different. And they saw our humanity. They had not seen us as human. They hadn't seen people like us
See, I think
as
folks,
humans
yeah, I
before.
think folks see us as a threat, you
Yeah.
know, and you know, I'm sure you heard the old word of the communist, the socialist, the un-American, you're unpatriotic, you hate your country, you, right? Those kind of tactics and reactions to anything different, especially in rural Mississippi or rural South Georgia, you know. So, where is all that now in terms of the work you do? And I asked David this the other day. It seems to me like, having gotten exposed to the work that People's Institute was doing in the 90s and, according to you, the 80s, right? There's a part of me that feels like academics were privy to those workshops in a lot of cases, and then folks go out and they write books and they do create careers, because that space, and it was in, I think, Tremay, where we went for that workshop, was the first place I ever, you know, saw the work of Michael Washington talking about white people were invented roughly around 1619 for political reasons, and posing those questions of how did Europeans get turned into white people and why, and the idea of privilege and status, the idea of institutional racism, not just individual racism, right? So y'all have got to, I mean, having been a part of that 40 years ago, like, what's it like now to see the terrain as well as the backlash? Because I think y'all were instrumental, having lived in the Pacific Northwest and other places like that. It seems to me that work had a real impact, and now we're seeing both the pluses and negatives of it.
I think you're absolutely right, Mark. And I think that the way in which I see it, first of all, it makes me very, very hopeful to see so many people who are white having this conversation. I mean, it was taboo for so long that now that it's no longer taboo, it is very hopeful to me that we, as you were saying earlier, we're not doing this work to undo racism in order to help those people. No, it's about helping ourselves. And that's really the joy that comes in it.
You
And
gotta
and
you gotta
being
say more about that, though, because I don't think that makes sense in the
okay,
context of white supremacy.
okay. What I mean is, let me go back and just tell a quick story. When we were doing this work in the mid 80s, for example, there were very few of us who were white who were calling ourselves anti-racist. It was rare. And we were so proud of ourselves. We were so full of ourselves. But we were this tight little group of people, tiny little group of people. And we hadn't really done very much work about who we are and whose we are and our ancestral stories and our familial stories. We had just been individuals, as you said. I'm just Marjorie. And what we were told by the people in the People's Institute, the African American leaders said, look, y'all who are white have got to get together and start sharing your own stories with one another. And we were really mortified by that idea. We thought, oh, no, no, no. I get all of my sort of, you know, street creds, as it's called these days, from hanging out with people of color. I don't want to be with other white people.
Yeah.
And that was that whole individualism. I'm the one who's woke. I'm the one who's better than. I'm the one that's this or that. But what we did, because they told us we had to do it, not because we wanted to, is we did get together and we did start telling our stories with one another. And we did, in fact, create a community that was able to have these conversations in a loving way, in a caring way, recognizing all of our differences of class, of geography, of religion, all the different ways in which we were different. And yet we recognized that we all had this thing of whiteness that had been foisted upon us through history in order to keep us separate from other people in this world. What a dreadful legacy that is. And what we need to be able to do with that legacy is to explore it, understand it better. And I'll tell you one last story that has to do with that very idea of the joy that comes from this work. I was with I used to brag. I used to say, oh yeah, my mother and my sisters and my children, they've all been to this workshop. They're all doing anti-racist work. And I'd be so full of myself telling that. But you know what? I wasn't willing to go to my brother. I thought I was writing off my brother. I was saying, oh, my brother's just too, he's too much, he's too rich, he's too conservative. And one day, not very long ago, I was with my brother and sisters. This is about 3 years ago. And my brother leaned to me and he said, tell me about your work, Marjorie. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, I'd be interested in learning more about what you do. And so I pulled my little soapbox out and started telling him and all of that. And what he did is he leaned in and he said, really, that's very interesting. Do you ever have your workshops in this area? This was Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
And I lied, actually. Out of shame, I said, well, yeah, maybe we do now and then, even though I had just done one in Philadelphia not long before. And he said, well, the next time you have a workshop here, I'd like to come to it. And I thought to myself, that is what this work is about. This work is about bringing people together. This work is not about throwing people away. This isn't about canceling people because they're not as woke as I am. That's all baloney.
Yeah.
I don't find that stuff useful at all. In fact, I find that very disorganizing. And so what I try to do in my work is I try to love people into this work. I sound like I'm, an evangelist. Well, maybe I am.
Well, and that's I have my local friends who are, not progressives ears on all the time. And it a lot of it, because I think it challenges dominant culture, doesn't translate. We can tell these wonderful stories because we've had them, right? And I don't even like the word work at times. I wish we had a better word than work, right? Yeah. But I get you. But I would also say, and I think you would agree, trying to get white people to talk together about race is not easy. It takes time, right? And it's I would just argue we manifest our stuff when we try to do that, which could be informative and useful. But it's not easy. And if I were to add an addendum to what you said, I think the other part of why this is in the interest of white people is I have relationships with folks of color that I'm not supposed to have. Not that they're perfect, and I have learned my life is so much richer and exciting and vibrant and deep because of that. That's right. And I think of all the unnecessary fear I don't carry around anymore. So I think that's a big difference and shift in doing it because it's the moral thing or the just thing or the constitutional thing or the American thing, but it's also kind of a self-interest thing,
Yeah, let me just say that I have found over the last few years that I've been doing this work and being comfortable with using the term, speaking as a white woman, speaking as a white person, and being able to name that. And when I do that, as you say, in relationship with other people, especially if I'm around people of color, and that happens to be something I say, that the relationship changes, it shifts. Because what I have found is that people of color don't really see most of us who are white as full human beings. They see us as white people. And we don't want to be seen as just white people, but that's often how we're seen by other people because of the society that we live in. And so if I name it, if I say, as a white person, I think it's important that we whatever it is. But naming myself is a way of sort of signaling to folks, oh, she knows who she is. She can talk about this. And it opens up opportunities, like you say, the opportunities for having relationships across racial lines, which are difficult and fraught and not easy. And yet we do that. We do it at the workplace all the time, don't we? But those are not necessarily going into our personal lives. Our workplace relationships can be really close. And yet we sometimes go home to our own separate homes, our own separate families, and not see each other in our full context as human beings. So this work makes us more human. That's its job.
Well, and again, I think it's complicated because I've also had folks of color get annoyed at white people acknowledging they're white, kind of in as a badge of, hey, I'm down too, right? So it's really complicated. The other thing that I run into here a lot with my conservative brothers and sisters is they think I'm calling them a racist. So recently on a call-in conservative talk show, I was asked if I was calling conservatives a racist, and I said, well, I have racism, and I think that's one of the things I wanted to just make sure comes out in our conversation, because we're not utterly inoculated, right? Can you just say about kind of what internalized white supremacy is in your life, what internalized racism is,
Sure.
and even after 40 years, right?
That's right. This is a lifetime. I often liken racism to being in our cultural DNA.
Mm.
It's never going away. It's really never going away. And so, for example, I walk out of my apartment and I walk across the street to the store, and I expect to be treated like a full human being. I see something happening and I call the police, and I expect the police to
Do
respect
their
and
job.
serve me.
Yeah.
And all of these things are building up in me a sense of I can do these things and nobody has to challenge me. And that is very deep, because what it does is it causes us to really not fully appreciate how impacted this idea of being better than
Yeah.
is affecting us every single day. And it's not because we're bad people. It's because we have been taught something through all the media, through all the culture, through everything else. We have been taught that, and it's not going to go away, but we can at least explore it. We can at least go into it and think, what does it mean that I am always saying things before anybody else? What does it mean that I always expect to be heard? What does it mean that I always expect to be safe? Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
That is such an incredible position to have in this society. If I don't understand that, then I'm going to start saying, well, I'm better than. And those who don't have those things are not as worthy as I am.
Yeah.
And that's where the racism shows up.
And
Is
it's
that we,
tricky, even when we start doing this stuff, to not make this stuff how I know better, right? I've been
yeah,
guilty of it. I mean, I was doing the whole woke thing before there was a word woke, right? Just we called it self-righteousness, you
that's
know.
right. That's
Um,
right. That's right.
can I ask a real quick organizing question? Because I don't know how much time you had today, but one of the things I've been thinking about a lot lately, and I know you and David read Resma Menakem's book on My Grandmother's Hand that talks about trauma, right? And I'm reading it now, but I think the other part of this is that this isn't just a head thing, and we haven't. It seems to me, as organizers and whatever else we want to call ourselves, especially those of us who are men, we just think, and I think liberal educators think, if I just give people enough facts, facts are enough to prove the data's, institutional inequality and so forth. But it does seem to me that there is this internal, the psychological dimensions of discovering that the world isn't the way I thought it was, right? That my country is not what I thought it was. I, I am white, and where in the hell did, like, do you know what I'm saying? That there's all this kind of internal lockdown in terms of emotions and feelings. And it seems to me that I haven't seen, and maybe y'all did it in European descent, but those of us who are organizers, like you said, love people through that process, which happens at their own pace to some degree, not to privilege them.
Yeah.
But can you just say something about kind of the role of emotion in this and how that plays in? Because this isn't just a head thing. Like you said, it's in our DNA. I feel like the world should do exactly and be exactly like the way I want it to be.
No, I hear you so well. I really do, Mark. And one of the things I would say, it's not just an emotional thing, but it's a spiritual fact.
Yeah.
It's a
Yeah.
spiritual journey that we haven't got a wholeness about us. One of our colleagues speaks about the huge distance between our head, the 13 inches from our head to our heart.
Yeah.
And we who have become white in this society have really stayed in our heads because we're afraid. We're often
We don't want to
afraid
feel it.
of some of the feelings that will
Yeah.
come. And what we have found in this work is that, and you say, it's not just work, it's a life. What
Yeah.
we have found in this life is that the sense of community, the sense of possibility has enabled us to laugh, has enabled us to tell jokes, has enabled us to play, has enabled us to worship together in a way that really does create a sense of our being whole people. And I find myself in that way, struggling still to this day, because I was raised in a head family. We were nothing but head. And it was so difficult because all those feelings and emotions were pushed down. We weren't allowed to even tell our stories to one another. And yet we have got to do that, because it's through the stories that we start to feel these things. We start to laugh together. We start to cry together. We start to be fearful together. You know, what's going to happen? And that creates that sense of trust, I think, that begins to build a community that has got a different view, a different way of seeing the world, a different idea of the possibility. As Dr. King called it, the beloved community is a wonderful vision. And I think we can all get there. I think we just have to wade through a lot of these messages that we've received, that we're supposed to be better than, that we're supposed to be just individuals, that we're supposed to do it all by ourselves. Nobody can do that. And we're finding that out, aren't we?
Yeah, well, I think a part of American culture is if we're uncomfortable, something's wrong. If we're feeling something, something's wrong, right?
Yeah.
You know, having worked with men a lot, specifically around male violence, you know, one of the things we would do with adjudicated men who were arrested and court ordered for domestic violence and child abuse is that we just did a lot of work with them around them recognizing what they're feeling. You know, I mean, I'm grown men, you know, and you know, emotional literacy, I guess, is what it's now called, right? But
Yeah.
and all the kind of anti-racist circles and efforts I've been a part of, that conversation has oftentimes not been there. And you know, I really just, I don't say that to slam anybody, but it seems to be so important, and hopefully we can integrate more of that in. The only other thing I meant to say this earlier, I struggle, you know, I think King gets taken out of context around the content of character thing, right? To go back to colorblindness for just a second, you know, it's interesting to see how conservative folks use King to say that talking about race is racist, right? Or seeing race is racist, versus King never said that, right? But it's, yeah, I don't know. Is there stuff that you want to talk about? Because I don't want to dictate
No, I see that. I know that we're getting close to the time frame, but I just wanted to add to that whole idea of how we talk together. I've spent a lot of time, and especially in the last few years, with white women in particular. And what we have found, I think, I'm not sure this is true, but I think what we are finding is that we're really trying to find our way to that sort of spiritual rootedness that enables us to be vulnerable with one another. Very hard to do. Very, very hard to do. We think we have to put up barriers all the time. And what I have found is that when we start really probing very close to home, when we start probing, what are we doing in our neighborhoods? What are we doing in our faith communities? What are we doing in our families? If we start probing those kinds of places together, not just trying to figure it out alone, but probing it together and saying things even if we don't have all the words for it. We don't necessarily know how to talk yet. But I think that, as one of our colleagues talks about, we don't have the fluency to talk about race and racism. And as we begin to have these conversations, we'll make mistakes, and we will not be throwing one another away for making a mistake. We will bring, it's the idea of calling in instead of calling out, the idea that we must come together, because the world really can't have this racist construct to survive. It is going to destroy us. And so finding our way to our own humanity in smaller groups and then using that ability to talk to our children. We've got to be able to talk to our children really early on, very young age. It has to be age appropriate, obviously, but children get it. They understand the notions of fairness. They understand when they've been bullied. They understand, and if we can talk about that and bring race into it, if it's there, and it's almost always there, if we can bring race into it in a way to try to be clarifying and try to be explaining what's going on, or trying to have the kids find the words for that. To me, it's been a beautiful thing to watch children lead us truthfully, lead us in this process. And you see young people today in high school and junior high school, they're hungry for these conversations. They want these conversations. They need them. And they really do hunger for them. So I think we're obliged, whether we like it or not, whether we're comfortable or not, whether we know everything or not, we're obliged to have those conversations with them.
Isn't that what it means to be a human, to be vulnerable, to not know all the answers, to meet you, you know what I mean? Well, and I don't want to end it on this last thing, but I struggle with optimism in particular, and it doesn't matter, I think we have to do what we do because it's the human, moral, rewarding thing it is, right? Are you concerned at all, given what we've seen recently with January the 6th? I feel like I'm maybe more concerned about it because I'm up close and personal to it daily. I, for one, feel like there's this effort to reinstate the system and you know what I mean, backlash to reimpose white male supremacy, to make America great again, even though no conservative folks will tell me a date where it was great for everybody, right? And it seems to me that there's a significant number of Americans that might rather, not because they're bad people, because this is how white supremacy works, would maybe rather destroy the country. And we've seen this in other places and other forums, Yugoslavia and so forth. But do you have any concerns about the backlash and counter movements that are happening, even though there's a lot of stuff on the positive end happening?
No, I hear you loud and clear, and I certainly would be foolish not to feel very, very concerned about that. But I also recognize that we have to look to history. We recognize a lot of people are saying this is like the 1850s. It is.
Yeah,
in many, many ways it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And to understand that history of the 1850s is to understand how perilous times we are in, because we are not able to sustain democratic society and democratic institutions until and unless we have a sort of civic participation saying this is how we want to be together.
Yeah.
And I think that we're having a tremendous number of people and institutions, in fact, who are very, very anxious to not move into this multiracial, multicultural future of the United States. And they will probably do what they can to make sure that doesn't happen. Yeah. And with that, given that, then we have to look to history. There's a wonderful phrase, there's hope in history, which means that as we have these conversations, we get strong, we get brave, and we determine that we are going to support this democratic society. We are going to make sure that it exists and continues to exist. And we who are white especially have to find our way into the leadership of that, not because we have the answers, but because we created this thing called race. We got to figure out how to make sure that our white brothers and sisters understand that we've all been bamboozled, basically. We've all been had, we've all been played. And that what's going on now is the outcome of that tremendous ideology of racism that says that we are better than, and it's killing us. And it's going to kill us if we don't say, no, that is not what we want. What we want is humanity, full humanity for everybody. And that's why I have both a lot of fear, a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry, and I also see history having really been able to find its way to being more humane. And that's what I'm working toward with myself every day. That's what I do every day.
Having done this for a while, I don't think I've ever been as, especially here, concerned as I am now. And the other part of history, right, is that it was bloody. And I just want to say that and acknowledge that. So
no, and I would be, it would be naive of me to say, oh, no, 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 that's not going to happen. I don't know whether that's going to happen or not. I really don't. I agree. I lived in the South most of my life, so I know what you're talking about, but it is. Sorry about that. I was trying
missed
to,
the last sentence of
there's
that.
such a lot of noise outside of my window that I apologize for that.
It's
really
actually not coming through, so don't.
Okay, well, it's trucks and buses and all kind of stuff.
Occasionally, but
in any case, what I was starting to say is that we have got to find our way back to understanding how every single effort to become more democratic, more humane, more social, more equitable has been broken up because of racism. Every single movement, whether you're talking about the labor movement or the agrarian movement or the abolitionist movement, every movement has been broken up because of racism. And if we can understand that, and if we can understand how racism is being used to divide us, that's its whole purpose. That's its main purpose, is to divide us. And what's happening is that the division is that which is allowing this terrible narrative about, keep America white, keep America great. I don't know what you want to call it. That terrible narrative is the narrative of white supremacy. And it is not benefiting those of us who are white. It is not benefiting people of color, obviously, but it's not benefiting any of us. And we have to study ourselves into this understanding. We have to talk ourselves into this understanding. We have to party and play and dance ourselves into this understanding. Because if we listen to the artists, they're the ones that are telling us what's going on. And I think that's where we have to go.
Are you still a person of faith, like religious faith?
I have a great deal of faith.
But you're married to a preacher is why I asked.
I'm married to a preacher. I am absolutely married to a preacher. It's interesting you should ask that, because David and I read to each other in the morning.
That's what he said.
And one of the things we're reading to each other is a book by Richard Rohr called The Universal Christ, which is a beautiful book, I will say, that has to do with how we took this figure of Jesus and we made him into this little truncated creature, and we didn't make him universal. We didn't allow him to be universal. And it's a beautiful book because it really helps me with my own faith journey, understanding how universal is our faith and how that's how we are intended to be as people, to be universal with the world. And that's what'll make us good at being ecologists. It'll make us good at being engaged with people that come from a lot of different traditions, a lot of different backgrounds. We can be with them because they are also part of this universal Christ. Yeah. And that's what I think is part of my faith tradition, where I'm going.
Yeah, we also made him white.
I did, but I would say that Richard Rohr is trying to say, nah.
Yeah, no,
God didn't have any notion about that.
Dude, right? Not many white folks, right? Well, Marjorie, thank you. I mean, I don't know if there's anything else. I'll let you off here, but I appreciate you having the conversation with me and what you do and what you've modeled, and so thank you for the conversation today and the time.
I love being with you. It really is a pleasure, Mark. Thank you for having me.
No problem. And I'm going to try to pause this and